Have you noticed that we live in a world full of noise? There's a good chance that somebody's cell phone will grace us with a notification in the next hour, or maybe even a phone call. I remember a great story Peter Gomes used to tell about being with the Queen of England during a chapel service at Windsor, and somebody's cell phone started ringing. And nobody wanted to look and see whose cell phone was ringing. Nobody wanted to fess up, and nobody said, "Oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I have to take this." Finally, as it just kept ringing and ringing and ringing, the Queen looked over in the direction of the sound and said, "You might want to answer that. Somebody important might be calling." Televisions are constantly running in the background, often with the news. Podcasts or YouTubes are playing on our laptops while we cook dinner. News alerts and social media notifications are popping up on our screens constantly, and opinions come at us all day long. Everybody is constantly talking. Everybody has something to say. Everybody is explaining or arguing or persuading or connecting or posting or reacting. And for all of our talking, there are these moments when it feels as though we understand each other less and less. We hear one another all the time, but hearing and listening are not always the same thing. Sometimes it feels as though we're all standing in the same room speaking different languages. Not because we cannot hear the words, but because we cannot quite hear hearts long enough to understand their message. Somebody said earlier this morning at Adult Christian Formation, "Sometimes I just need to be heard." To which I replied, "Girl, sometimes we all just need to be heard." We miss each other's hopes and fears and dreams. We miss out. We miss each other's wounds, and we miss each other's longing when we just talk past one another. We are more like inhabitants of Babel than we would care to admit. Because Babel was never simply about language barrier, right? It was about distance. It was about human beings becoming unable to find one another, connect to one another. And into that kind of world, God sends God's own Spirit. And this is Pentecost. The wind is shaking the house. The fire is appearing over people's heads. Disciples are suddenly rushing out into the street at 9 o'clock in the morning with confidence and clarity and purpose. It's cinematic in its scope. It's a scene worthy of a John Ford film or David Lean or Steven Spielberg. And that's the way that we like it, right? We like all of the pomp and circumstance. We like the adrenaline pumping. We like the awe-inspiring. We like our senses overwhelmed. But I wonder whether the disciples experienced it that way. Because before there was wind and there was tongues of fire and before there were crowds gathering around in amazement, there was simply a room full of people waiting. Now, here's the truth about waiting. Waiting always sounds more spiritual in church than it feels in real life. Most of us don't particularly like or enjoy waiting. In our age of authenticity, nobody likes to wait. Nobody wants to be kept from that event or that moment or that person or that tweet or that post which is going to help them actualize themselves. We hate waiting. The more money you make, the less waiting you do. Less waiting in traffic. Waiting for the dreaded spinning, streaming wheel while your movie freezes in the frame at the very best part. I don't know about you, but I'm at the very end, the downstream end of my neighbors with the streaming internet. And when it's Saturday night and I'm getting to that moment and it starts to glitch up, maybe it's not blessing that I'm throwing to my neighbors. We hate to wait for the test results, waiting for our relationship to heal, or waiting when life just feels uncertain. Because waiting feels suspiciously like doing nothing. And we have become very uncomfortable with doing nothing. Waiting. Well, lucky for us, we have these pocket computers that we have with us all the time, and they keep us busy while we are waiting. The truth is, when uncertainty appears, we reach for our tools. We reach for our crutches. We make plans. We strategize. We organize. We fix. We hurry. We worry. We multitask. We begin acting as though the future somehow depends entirely upon us drumming up something to fill the gap created by our waiting. I imagine 2,000 years ago in that room, some of the exasperated disciples saying, finally, well, shouldn't we do something? I mean, somebody else could say, well, we need a plan, right? Somebody pulling out a piece of parchment and saying, I have ideas. But Jesus told them simply to stay put and wait. And so they sat there with nothing but a promise, waiting. And the writer of Acts says, suddenly, from heaven there came a sound like the crash of a rushing and violent wind. Now we're talking. Back into the spectacle, back into the excitement of that moment. Our attention is immediately, it goes to the dramatic parts, the wind, the fire, the languages. But before all of that, if we can suspend our need to fill the waiting with something, with anything, something else is happening here. Breath. God's breath. God's breath moves over the chaos in Genesis. God's breath moves into dust and Adam lives. God asks Ezekiel in the valley of the very dry bones, can these bones live, mortal? And Ezekiel responds, oh Lord, you know. God breathes, and chaos becomes creation. God breathes, and dust becomes humanity. God breathes and very dry bones live again. God breathes and they simply receive what only God can give: life. Pentecost is not the story of human beings finally getting themselves together. Pentecost is the story of God breathing life where human beings had run out of life to give. And in the midst of today, Jesus stands in the middle of the crowd at the most important day of the festival, and he cries out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me." And then he says, "Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." And John tells us that he is speaking of the Spirit. The Spirit is not only and simply given to fill us. The Spirit is given to move in and through us. Living water flows. It cannot be diverted. It cannot be controlled. And that helps us to understand the miracle of Pentecost itself and why 2,000 years ago we're all in a room together on a Sunday morning wearing red. Because the miracle is not merely that people spoke, even in other languages. The miracle is that people heard and understood. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Episcopalians, Pentecostals, Democrats, Republicans even. People from every imaginable place suddenly hear the good news of God, and they hear it in their own language. They don't just stop being who they are. God doesn't ask them to put aside their Parthian or their Mede. No, they remain Parthians and Medes. They remain Elamites. They remain Episcopalians, Democrats, and Republicans. They remain who they are. Because God does not make them less than who they are. God makes them the most they've ever been before. The difference remains. But difference no longer divides. Pentecost is God arriving where human beings had run out of life to give. The miracle of Pentecost is that a room full of frightened and uncertain people discovered that God had not forgotten them. That while they were waiting, while they were wondering what comes next, while they were resisting the urge to just fill the silence and manufacture a future for themselves, God was already at work, moving, inspiring, enlivening, and arriving in places that seemed dead, that seemed empty, and places that felt like there was no hope. God was coming to people who were waiting and gathering people who otherwise never would have found one another. Difference remains. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, we remain who we are. Only now we discover that that which once separated us no longer has the final word. Because the breath of God moves always towards places that feel empty, towards chaos, towards very dry bones, towards thirsty hearts. And that is good news for us all. Because all of us are waiting for something right now. All of us are waiting. Waiting for healing, waiting for clarity, waiting for peace, waiting for whatever comes next. And the miracle of Pentecost is you are not waiting alone. You are not waiting alone. The Spirit, she is already on the move.